Hello and welcome. My name is Angelica Catalay and I'm with New Mexico Sentencing Commission. I'm a research scientist for New Mexico Sentencing Commission. As of right now, we are going to start off with a video of interviews for our questions for our COVID-19 pandemic and the criminal justice system, in the sector of the criminal justice system, sorry. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the video.
All right, I'm Derek Chin with the New Mexico Sentencing Commission, and I am doing an interview with Bennett Bauer, the Chief Public Defender for the state of New Mexico. I am now going to begin with the questions. Okay, can you describe the changes that your agency or department has made to continue working during the pandemic?
Sure. Well, at the very beginning, it was obviously very confusing, and it really focused on health and safety of employees and of our clients and justice partners. So a lot of it was sort of clearing out the office while we were figuring out what was going on with COVID. And so we had to transition to working from home for the vast majority of people, reacting to some positive tests that we got fairly early on when so few people knew how COVID was being transmitted. There were deep cleaning of offices, social distancing, and going through multiple versions of our COVID safe policies, which kind of tried to govern how people were going to get their work done and stay safe. We had a lot of IT work to try and get people set up in their homes to do work. And so there was really that shifting of resources, buying some new equipment, and then figuring out how people were going to relate to each other. Also, how were we going to serve clients with whom we couldn't meet in person? Whether a fair number of our clients are homeless or hard to get hold of. So how do we try and maintain communication with them, maintain communication with our clients who are in custody, either in jails or in prison facilities, and talk to them about what's happening. And so there was a lot of adjustment, especially at the front end, to try and both take care of our duties to the courts and especially our duties to our clients in our new circumstances.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about how you maintain contact with your clients due to the remote nature? I assume you did over the computer for most part.
Well, computer or phones. Almost all of our offices, probably all of our offices at some point closed to the public. For instance, when there were positive COVID tests, which happened in many of our offices at some point. Not necessarily transmission within the office. In fact, I don't think we ever traced any positive COVID case to transmission within an office. But of course, there was transmission outside the offices and potential exposure within the offices. So it was closing access to the public, trying to provide alternatives, meaning sometimes by video, but often by phone, forwarding our phones to home numbers, which created new concerns because people didn't always have cell phones, for instance. You were worried about talking to clients or talking to the jails using a cell phone number or a home number that could be traced. And so there were different ways some of our offices used some kind of a Google phone number that allowed the number not to be traced, or to have a special phone number that wasn't your cell number, but you could get the call on your cell. So there was a lot of innovation, a lot of communication about this. Frankly, it was incredibly hard at the beginning to communicate with our justice partners, to attend court, to figure out how to do these things and keep in touch with clients. But really the client communication was the hardest part. it got better over time, and a lot of that was getting information out and having our staff and our lawyers get used to the idea that we had to do a lot more direct reaching out to clients rather than waiting for them to come to us.
Okay. Has the past year of the pandemic created any shifts in public defense on a more larger scale that maybe you've responded to or borrowed from like other jurisdictions?
Yeah. So there's the technological, there's a number of issues in there probably. One of them is the technology and the use of technology in the criminal court system. And I think right now, this may be jumping ahead to some of your other questions.
Yeah, I think it's overlapping a little bit.
We had to adapt. Okay, so you know, there's some efficiencies that we found that didn't affect or even improved representation. So the greater use of video communication with clients who are in jails, because jails set up video links, for instance, which they hadn't done before. That is fantastic because it made it easier to talk to our clients. But on the other hand, it made it impossible to have the in-person contact. You have to have both. You have to have easy, direct contact, either by phone or by video, and that is now easier in many places. And so just checking in with the client, letting them know we're here, letting them know when their next court date may be, but not necessarily having an in-depth conversation or talking about the resolution of their case is a lot easier. But as we're transitioning out, we don't want to lose a return to the human aspect of our representation, which is sitting down literally with someone in a room, eventually without masks, but not yet. But even with masks, you know, you can read somebody's body language. You can see whether they are understanding the things that you're saying to them. You can ask for a response. It's a lot different than being on the phone or on video. And because we deal with clients with often with mental health issues, being in person, being able to read that kind of body language and interpret it and know that they understand what you're telling them is really important. So on the other hand, we found that there are ways we can do things better. For instance, court hearings that were 5-minute court hearings, but people were driving several hours to get to. I think there's a general agreement within the court system that we can find these efficiencies and use them, but we don't want to lose the, you know, the human aspect of the contact with those charged with crimes for our office or for the courts.
Okay, so obviously client contact seems like a priority that's definitely going to carry forward. Are there any other priorities that are going to carry forward now that the pandemic is starting to come to an end? Yeah,
one of the other interesting things was that early on in the pandemic, I think that law enforcement and prosecutors were forced to really prioritize, right? That law enforcement, when many of us were unsure how COVID was transmitted, were very reluctant to make traffic stops, to make contact with people that could be infected. And so the number of arrests, especially for low-level offenses, really plummeted. It really went down. And I think we found that that in and of itself did not affect public safety. It didn't have a negative effect. It didn't create more crimes. Less policing didn't create more crimes. And there are lessons that we need to learn from that. And I think part of that is that in some parts of the state, there has traditionally been over-policing. There has been policing for the purposes of searching for drugs and finding drugs. You know, a legacy of the war on drugs and the idea that police are here not just to make sure people don't hurt each other, but to enforce, you know, these kinds of status offenses, or to arrest and charge for these kinds of status offenses, which often don't actually increase public safety. Because we know that less policing along those lines didn't, and there may be some arguments about this over time, didn't increase you know, the number of other kinds of crimes that do impact public safety. I think we have lessons to learn. On the other hand, we know that in many of our communities in New Mexico and all over the country, there's been an increase in, for instance, the number of murders. I believe that that is not tied to anything that had to do with policing here or the pandemic or anything like that. There's some other social force that's happening that will recede, but we don't want to learn the wrong lessons and try to again go back to over policing to address that. So lessons to learn from how our community should be policed and what is really important in terms of making arrests and trying not to go back to the same way we always do things.
Okay, that was actually the answer to question 4 as well. So we'll go on to question 5. What were some of the best COVID-inspired changes in your agency and department, and how are you going to retain these changes to make them more effective?
So one of the things internally, one of the things that we had to grapple with was how our employees, staff, lawyers could continue to serve our clients while dealing with what was happening with their families under COVID. You know, their responsibilities when children were home from school, when we couldn't come into the office, when people were trying to care remotely for their parents. And I think we have learned that we can do this in a different way. And so we are going to keep some of the telework and remote working. For instance, many of our employees are going to be eligible for this as long as we know that they are getting the work done that's necessary to serve the court system and our clients. And so one of the changes is to have more flexibility in how we imagine the workplace and how we get our work done. There's also the way that we appear in courts and the way that the court functions with adapting the use of this technology so that, for instance, we can save sometimes hours in travel time. For instance, from Santa Fe to the courthouse in Tierra Maria, which is in northern Rio Arriba County, is about an hour and 45 minutes each way. If you can appear by video there at 9 o'clock in the morning, you can appear in several other courthouses around the state throughout the rest of the day without having to drive through spotty cell service. So there are some really important changes that I think all of us are trying to adapt to that will make us more efficient and more effective in our use of the limited resources that we have.
Okay. What were some of the detrimental impacts that COVID-19 had in your agency and department? And actually, I'd like to add on to that. Have there been any problems with using the remote court appearances with, communicating with judges or with clients? I know that's been talked about as a problem elsewhere, so I was wondering if you've ever had any issues.
Yeah, definitely. Again, I think it comes back, in terms of our clients, it comes back to the human aspect. How do you establish a relationship with someone who is under stress because they're facing criminal charges, who doesn't know us, who probably doesn't trust us, but whom we have to help make certain really important decisions, and especially if they're in a jail, with all these health effects around them, not able to exercise. This was really one of the biggest problems and detriments is really being able to establish relationships. And so many of these things were being done on video. Almost all the hearings except for trials, especially jury trials, were being done on video. So first of all, the attorney-client relationship. Secondly, trials are less effective, I believe, when it's not done in person. And even when it's in person with masks. How do you judge somebody's credibility who's a witness? If they're in mask, or even worse, if they're on video. How does a judge decide whether somebody's a danger to the community? How does the judge read the body language of the defendant when they're deciding is there something wrong with this person? Do I feel comfortable, reacting to their speech patterns, not just what they're saying on a screen in a mask, but in front of the judge, because the judge is making critical decisions about defendants every day. And not being in person changes that so much of your reaction to someone. And so I think that was a detriment, that we lost some of that during the pandemic. And in a number of these areas, it's really important that we go back to being in person for at least the critical decision-making times in any case.
Okay. Has the pandemic had any effect on alternatives to incarceration for your clients who are participating in a program?
Yeah. So I think early on, first of all, the jail populations in most counties went way down. And that was overall something that was really good for our clients, because I think there was a problem with over incarceration for people being held pre-trial and perhaps post-trial as well. As a sentencing, there's way too much of a reliance on the idea that jail has some positive benefit for people, while ignoring what every study shows is some truly negative impacts it has on people. For instance, almost every day somebody spends in jail, at least when they don't have an incredibly long criminal record, affects their their ability to keep housing, to get housing, to have a job, to keep a job, to keep family contacts. And so I think that there was much less reliance on incarceration because people were afraid of it, rightfully so, and didn't want to put people in jail unless they felt there was no other alternative. On the other hand, it cut back a lot on in-person contacts and a lot of the programs that were available. So I think there were a lot of people that weren't getting treatment that probably would have benefited from treatment. So again, we have realized since the pandemic started that we relied too much on incarceration. We are now, frankly, in a really good place now that people can be in the same room again. Now that people doing treatment programs can sit in the same room with someone and actually provide, some kind of effective treatment. We have to adopt these, go back to some of the things that were working before and understand that there's a lot of alternatives that are less expensive and more effective than incarceration, that we can adapt, save money, be more efficient, and be more effective.
Okay. The final question, I think we've touched on this a little bit before about how some of your lawyers are starting to do more of their work remotely, but are there any other tasks that your employees are regularly undertaking that will stay remote?
Yeah, a number of our staff people in the fiscal department and the human relations department have been working almost exclusively remotely. And so for instance, the kinds of documents that in the past, everybody would have been sitting around, something would have been printed out, taken to somebody for a signature, or printed out for a signature, and then taken to somebody else for a signature, and then, faxed or emailed. We are all doing this sometimes in a matter of a couple of minutes through video, through e-signatures and stuff like that, and saving a lot of time. So there are a lot of people who are going to be working from home, and we're developing ways to monitor and make sure that, that they're doing what they're supposed to do so that the taxpayers are getting their money's worth and so that our clients are being served. But we're not going back to the way things were before. There are a lot of tasks that can be done remotely and sometimes much, much more efficiently. We are keeping those specific kinds of tasks, saving commute time, travel time for lawyers, and gas money, hotel money, all those sorts of things. And that time can now be taken for our staff and our lawyers, and I think put much more effectively into hopefully client communication. Finding other ways that we can use the time that would have been spent on things that we now see were not the most effective way. So a lot of stuff that we have learned, adapted with, and will keep.
Good. That's all the questions I have. Thank you for your time.
Sure.
District Attorney Mary Carmack Altweeds is here today to discuss lessons learned and opportunities arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for giving your perspective today, Mary.
Well, you're quite welcome. I'm happy to do it.
Great. We'll step through 8 questions regarding the pandemic and how the criminal justice system has evolved to accommodate it. Can you describe the changes that your agency or department has made to continue working during the pandemic?
Yes, it's been quite a bit of changes. And actually, when the pandemic started, we shut down our office completely in late March of 2020. And we were shut down for about 6 weeks entirely. And we were able to do that because everyone in our office, every single employee has a laptop. So they were able to go home and they were able to continue working. We also are an entirely paperless office. And so we were able to pretty much carry on business as usual. But after about 6 weeks, it became clear that some employees had to be back in our office. People that were running NCICs, for example, that can't be done from home. And a few other probation violations, support staff, some other people had to go back into the office. But for the most part, during that transition and all the way through from then until now, we have been able to get employees hotspots, like I said, laptops, printers, scanners, so that we really could transition to more remote work. It initially made communication more difficult. Because we're just not able to pop our heads into somebody's office and say, hey, how's that project going? What's going on? But everyone has really adapted to it. And we are finding that remote work really is fairly possible.
Good deal. Has the last year plus of the pandemic created any shifts in prosecution?
Not shifts in prosecution per se, in the sense that when a criminal complaint comes into us, we still review it in the same way. We would still make charging decisions in the same way. And so the front end, here's how we're going to treat a case, has not really changed because of the pandemic. What has changed is how we are trying to deal with people either being or staying in jail, and then also people that we're trying to get into treatment programs. Pretty much all of the treatment programs shut down, at least for the time being, when the pandemic first started. And so people that were supposed to go as a term of their sentence, or people that needed to go so that they could be successful in probation, what have you, all of a sudden couldn't go and were not allowed in. Those programs, for the most part, have opened back up, but they are still operating on limited capacity. And so it's had to necessarily sort of enlarge the range of sentencing options that we had. And in some ways, we've had to be a lot more flexible in the sense that whereas before the pandemic, we would have required inpatient treatment counseling. Well, that's not possible anymore. So we've had to maybe extend periods of probation, but have people do combinations of outpatient treatment programs, plus more counseling and other things.
Good. I'm glad things were flexible.
We had to learn that on the fly.
Are there any priorities that might carry forward now that we are seeing the end of the pandemic?
Well, I think both of the things I just touched on actually will carry forward. I think that we have learned, both as our office and then judges and the judicial system in its entirety, was probably never going to switch over to court hearings and remote work. But because the pandemic forced us to do that, I think we all realized that it's not as bad as everyone thought, and that there are certain types of hearings and certain types of work that absolutely can be done at home. That doesn't mean that, you know, courthouses are going to close forever and we'll never go back, but we might be able to make the court system more efficient because we're able to shift certain types of hearings online. And certainly in our own office, in my own office, we have learned that we can work from home. We can do, I would say, you know, 50 to 75% of our jobs from home. And so part of my administration is we're going to be allowing people to continue to work from home at least 2 days a week moving forward, because it just, I think it increases people's life, you know, happiness and work-life balance. The other thing is that we learned that not only did we have to be flexible, but that we could be flexible. And so I think that sort of broadened the range of sentencing possibilities, you know, alternatives. It broadened the ideas that we could bring to the table with defense attorneys. And likewise, I think defense attorneys were also more flexible than they had been. And so we were really able to work together more to come up with different solutions that were not a possibility the first time.
Thank you. Have there been certain crimes or criminal behaviors that have increased or decreased during the pandemic? Because of the pandemic?
Yeah, so definitely. At the very beginning of the pandemic, we were quite surprised. I would say maybe the first 6 months, we saw a pretty dramatic drop in all forms of crime, particularly crimes that required people to be out and about, DWIs, for example. I don't think we even had more than 5 March, April, May, and June of last year. It was crazy. But that is starting to pick back up, sadly. And I expected at the beginning of the pandemic that there would be more domestic violence cases, maybe more child abuse cases, just because people were sort of forced to be together all the time. We didn't see that at the beginning of the pandemic, but I would say in the last 3-4 months, we are now seeing an increase overall in crime, and more upsetting, we're seeing that those crimes are getting more violent. So whereas before the pandemic, we might have seen a domestic violence that ended in misdemeanors, still not a good thing, but now we're seeing those same crimes with, you know, people with similar histories, they're picking up felonies because it's getting, you know, weapons are being used, or it's just, it's out of control. And so we are definitely seeing an uptick in violence and in the amount of crime.
What were some of the best COVID-19 required changes in your agency or department? And how do we retain these changes to make them more effective?
I think it was the remote work. It was forced upon us. I don't think that my office ever thought that we could really work from home. Just the nature of the work, having to be in court, you know, having to meet with victims, witnesses, police officers, what have you. We always thought that had to be in person, face to face. And then when we were forced to close, we all realized that we can handle things through Zoom, for example, and it works maybe not 100% as well, but 90% as well. And so the change that is going to stay, at least in my office moving forward, is that I will allow more work from home. We found that it can be just as or almost as efficient, and it really does help with quality of life and retention.
Great. What were the most detrimental impacts COVID-19 had on your agency or department?
Well, so then the flip side of that is that as managers, it's much harder to manage people when we're not seeing them face to face, when they're working from home all the time. And frankly, when we're working from home as well. And so it has made, there are certain classes of employees that were sent home and told to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they absolutely did that. And we had no concerns. The work still got done. Everything was good. there were certain other people, and I would actually include myself in this category, that found they could not work from home. Maybe they had screaming kids in the background. Don't know if you've heard that. Or they're just the type of people that if you're at home, you're wanting to do other things. There's dishes that need to be put in the dishwasher and I cannot focus until I go do that. And so we definitely learned that after a few months that there were some employees that we needed to monitor more frequently and more heavily because they weren't able or willing to work at home as efficiently as other employees. And so I think that's harder to figure out when someone is working from home. So it's made management, I think, a little more difficult. But I think overall, it's made all employees a little happier and probably more efficient once they figured out, the patterns and what they needed to do.
Has the pandemic had an effect on alternatives to incarceration?
So definitely. At the beginning of the pandemic, we sat down on Zoom. We sat down on Zoom with the public defenders in the First Judicial District, as well as our chief judge. And we actually went through our jail lists and tried to find inmates that were eligible to be released in the sense that they had a year or less left on their sentence. It was nonviolent. And all of those people, we tried to agree to go ahead and release, put them on probation or EM or some other kind of monitoring, maybe pretrial services, something along those lines. And that was at the very beginning. I'd say that was in March and April of last year. After that, judges became much more unwilling to keep people in jail, rightfully so. And so we really had to start looking for more alternatives to how people are going to be monitored, but not actually in custody. So I know that our county really increased, or Santa Fe County really increased its electronic monitoring capabilities. With regard to end of cases, with regard to sentencing, we really tried our best not to send people to prison. And so we found ourselves giving more and more opportunities or chances for people to stay out of prison. So they might have had to do a strenuous treatment program, lots of community service, the types of things where they have a structure in their life. It's just not a prison structure. And we tried to give them as many chances as we could in order to stay out of prison. And I think that was, I referred to it earlier, we really had to become more flexible and broaden our ideas about what was acceptable. And I think overall, it's been a good thing. And we've seen that being flexible is probably, it's probably better for the system and for individuals in the system in the long run.
Are there any tasks that you or your employees regularly undertake that will stay remote?
So tasks is sort of hard to answer in the sense that because our courts are still remote, except for jury trials, most of my employees can do almost everything from home. There are a few tasks like NCICs that I referred to earlier that we cannot do from home. It has to be done in the office. But nearly everything else we necessarily had to shift to online, and we found that it could be done. And so that will be something that we're going to allow to move forward. Like I said earlier, I think probably 2 days a week from here on out, we will allow people just to work from home. And so long as they're getting their work done and they're not being like me, incapable of working from home, they'll be able to continue to do that.
Well, great. Mary, thank you so much for your perspective today. I know we have a very busy schedule and we do appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome. I'm Angelica Fidelay with the New Mexico Sentencing Commission. Today I have the pleasure with speaking to Haven Plugin and the Director of Probation and Parole, Melanie Martinez. Hello ladies, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and ask a few questions, if you can, just directed towards your agency and department. That'd be awesome. So the first one is, can you describe the changes that your agency and our department has made to continue working during the pandemic?
Of course, COVID first started back March of 2020. We met and discussed how we can continue operations and make sure not only the officers are safe, but the population we supervise are also safe. So unfortunately, probation and parole, we can't fully work as far as working from home. So what we did was we transitioned to what we called, community supervision. And basically we transitioned to our officers doing socially distanced field calls, basically, checking up on the population and making sure that they were familiar with what was going on with the pandemic. We educated ourselves and we educated our population as well. I do want to turn it over to Ms. Goggin briefly to discuss the programming portion of Probation Pro and how we transitioned and the modifications we made to the programming.
Definitely. Thank you, Director Martinez. I think one of the big things that changed with the pandemic, especially was our use of technology, our use of video conferencing, video visits. And so a lot of time was spent educating our clients, especially in how to use video services. And we did that through officers contacting clients, walking them through the steps to set those things up on their electronic devices. And we also did that in preparation of knowing that our therapeutic and community treatment providers were going to have to transition to teleworking. And so they were going to have to then use this technology at their own homes. And so it started us in allowing everybody to be able to still communicate and services to still be given to our clients because they're much needed services and they're required as part of their supervision conditions. And so what we did was we set up our clients in order to do those video visits, but we also worked with all of our providers across the state of New Mexico to make accommodations for what they needed. Because we serve clientele statewide, as you know, across the state of New Mexico, things were very different. Some counties were more hotspots than other counties. And so we had to work individually with each of those counties and those providers that were in those counties in order to accommodate what the needs were at the time, so that we were always in compliance with the governor's health orders and ensuring that our clients were safe and our providers were safe. And so many of our providers went to telephone services. They went to providing therapeutic treatment and services by video conference and video visits online through FaceTime, through Zooms. We were able to continue to offer services to our clients, not just on the probation and parole side with office reporting, but they were able to attend group sessions of AANA on Zoom meetings. They were able to get therapeutic individual treatment and counseling on video visits through FaceTime or on the telephone with their therapeutic provider. I think one of the big things that changed this year is I think we made things a lot more personal because we had people make connections more because our clients were so isolated and people were feeling depressed and nervous just in general about the pandemic. And so we made contact more. Our therapeutic providers reached out and did more sessions with clients, checked in regularly, had clients check in with them, and it allowed us to continue to offer substance treatment, anger management, and all of the other parenting classes, all of the other therapeutic pieces that are part of probation and parole supervision, which I think was a really good, it actually, I think, helped our clients get through this time because it was so stressful.
And I will just add, I'm sorry, I will just add to that, and again, it was a pandemic, it was statewide, nationwide, worldwide, and it didn't touch any specific population. So along with educating ourselves, we had to educate the population as well. And I think, Haven touched on point that we reached out more often. We transitioned from in-office visits to virtual visits. We also had to teach our population how to transition to virtual visits. So it was a combination of educating ourselves and educating them. We did check in with them more often. Usually the requirements are anywhere from monthly, bi-weekly to weekly. And I think the officers did a great job reaching out and making sure everyone was okay. And I think as far as, you know, we promoted contact lists, whether it was drug testing or whatever the case may be, but we did promote the public health order while doing them.
You say the shift is more, it was more focused on going like computer-wise, but at the same time, stayed really personal. I like that. That's awesome.
Also keeping in mind, you know, victims, safety of the community as well.
Do you see any priorities that you guys made during this shift that we're going to see throughout the end of the pandemic possibly?
So I think, you know, as far as priorities go, our goal is to rehabilitate offenders. And I think, you know, with Haven touching on programming and the outreach, I think that is our continued priority is rehabilitation.
Definitely. And I would add also to that, just I think on the side of trying to provide resources that are needed to help people be more successful. And I think the pandemic taught us a lot about assisting people with utility payments if needed, helping with housing if needed, when crises happen in the lives of our clients, being able to intervene and assist, potentially keeping them from violating. And so those are the things I think that we will probably continue to do as well.
And we have been, you know, prior to COVID, that was one of our goals as well. It wasn't specific to the pandemic that we were offering services as far as resources, as far as rental assistance, utility assistance. But I think we can say that we amped up those efforts. We provided more services to the community, especially when, you know, the state shut down and you know, unemployment was on the rise. I think we amped up those services to focus on rental assistance and utilities and, you know, food, clothing, you know, alternative placements, those types of moves.
That's remarkable. I know that you guys said that there was an increase in anxiety, but did you guys see any other criminal behaviors that either increased or decreased during the pandemic?
You know, as far as our intakes, you know, did they slow down? Definitely. But did they stop? No.
What are some of the best COVID-19 required changes in your department, and how do you change changes and make them more effective?
You know, when we had to transition to virtual visits, I think we realized that we weren't where we needed to be as far as technology. So I do think that gave us options to check up on the population more frequently. I think the virtual visits have been a positive adjustment. Now, the goal, you know, now that the state's reopening, hopefully in July, the goal is to slowly bring back all populations into the office.
What were some of the most detrimental impacts COVID-19 had on your agency?
Well, like I mentioned, you know, before, probation parole, we can't really telework. You know, we can't work from home in order to provide the services that are needed, that are necessary. So we made adjustments. We weren't fully teleworking. We had to, you know, be flexible and creative how we supervise individuals. Yes, we transitioned to virtual office check-ins, and then we did get creative with continued drug testing on certain populations that were necessary. How do we do the contactless drug testing? It's exactly what it sounds like. You know, it was oral swabs, but we wouldn't have any contact with the individuals that we were testing. So, you know, and I would like maybe Haven to touch a little bit on how the programs adjusted as far as, you know, the academies and the pavilions.
Definitely. It was a transition, but it was a transition, I think, for everybody statewide kind of at the same time. And for clients that we had who were needing in order to attend inpatient treatment programs, it became a challenge because then you're looking at a congregate living facility and all of the challenges around COVID that went with congregate living. And so at the academies and at our transitional living homes statewide, we ensured that the providers were putting safety measures in place, that there were restrictions on people who could come in and out of the locations so that transmission could not enter the home. And one of the things that I think was the most surprising to me is how we continued services all year. We were able to offer clients inpatient treatment program services throughout this pandemic, despite the challenges that were created with clients having to wear masks everywhere, having to sit in classes wearing masks, having to change scheduling in terms of accommodating a 5-person capacity for a class. When you're looking at a program that's housing 70 people, we had to adjust all of the schedules in order to accommodate the smaller class sizes, the social distancing requirements that were put in place. And yet the programs in transitional houses across the state made those accommodations for the safety of the clients and to ensure that we did not get COVID spread from visitors or people entering for volunteer work, those kind of things. And so our hope moving forward is that we're able to really open up those facilities and have operations return somewhat back to normal, although I imagine we will continue to keep high sanitizing of all the areas, ensure that we're still following all of the guidelines in the governor's order. But I was grateful, and I know that the clients were grateful for those much needed services during this time.
Did you guys have any other impact with, like, and, you know, I know that you said you increased the housing and stuff like that. Were there any other alternatives to incarceration that you guys noticed, like increased efforts or decreased efforts or so on and so forth?
You know, pre-COVID, and again, since the new administration under Secretary Troy Lucero, I think probation parole has focused on alternative detention sanctions. So we try to find alternative resources, whether it's increased level supervision, you know, community service, and there's a list that we try to do alternative sanctions prior to incarceration. Unfortunately, you know, when someone's arrested on new charges, you know, we are obligated to place them into custody. I think, you know, this past year we have looked at alternative detention sanctions, and it has worked up to this point. And again, our goal is to continue working and rehabilitating and finding alternative to incarceration.
And the last question, I know that you guys aren't working remotely, so are there anything that you guys have remotely, like maybe your Zoom calls that you guys will keep over after the pandemic, after we go back to normal life?
No, and again, probation parole, supervisors, management team, you know, we did not telework this entire year. We were in the office, you know, complying with the public health order and all the COVID safe practices. And you know, it's hard to say if we're going to continue anything via Zoom. As far as our meetings go, I think we already had virtual meetings in place for those who had to travel from far places. As far as supervision goes, you know, it works for some individuals on supervision, and some need closer supervision, which sometimes they benefit from face-to-face interaction versus virtual interaction. So it's hard to say if that's going to continue or not at this point. And, you know, we're looking right now, we're digging deep to see what has worked for us, what changes we can make and moving forward. And I'm not sure if you wants to touch a little bit on the programming part of it.
I know for a lot of our therapeutic providers, this is probably something that they're going to keep in their tool belt because it was helpful and it made them able to accommodate clients who, let's say, have struggles with health conditions or have a temporary transportation issue, or who are in a hospice situation but still need treatment and counseling, whatever that looks like if they're struggling and can't make it into the offices for treatment that they may need or therapy that they may need. I know that our treatment providers, a number of them have spoken to me about the fact that they plan to continue to be able to offer that on a case-by-case basis to clients who need it so that the services can be offered, which is a great thing.
Is there anything else that you ladies would love to tell me regarding COVID-19 and pandemic and your guys' agency?
Well, I think, you know, this year has taught us to be patient and flexible and creative, not only dealing with our own staff, but those individuals on supervision. And I think everybody did a great job. We came together, we communicated, whether it was daily, weekly, you know, everyone was on the same page. And I think we all had the safety, which is important, safety of officers, safety of staff, safety of those individuals on supervision was one of our priorities. So, and I think, you know, it's great to see the collaboration and what we accomplished this past year, the most difficult year probably of our career in our life. So.
Thank you ladies so much. I appreciate your time and we will see you June 23rd. All right, with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Derek, and Derek is going to go ahead and go into our Q&A area. If you guys have any questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to use that Q&A area.
Yeah, hi. I believe Sherry sent out a little message about our Q&A. There should be a little button in the bottom of your screen. You type in your question there, and I'll make sure to read it. But other than that, I actually wrote up a few questions. Here at the Sentencing Commission, we've talked about these presentations a little bit, and you know, just come up with some additional questions that could be interesting for everyone. So something that's kind of been looming over this for me, anyways, is how there's been a lot of attention towards the criminal justice system over the last year. Lots of social movements like Black Lives Matter, lots of protests outside. So I'm wondering how these demands for fewer criminal justice interventions have caused your agency to reevaluate maybe some of your practices, or how the larger attention to criminal justice reform in general has affected your job. So maybe we could take this in order, starting with Ben from the Public Defender's Office.
Hi, Derek. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. So I think that we really have to sort of reevaluate a lot of what we're doing, and not just kind of the technical things, which is part of what we talked about, but what I think this is thrown into relief that our court system is an institution which has been going for, you know, many decades now, and sort of grown and built upon itself without us challenging some basic assumptions about the effectiveness. And I am hoping that a lot of the players, a lot of the justice partners in the system can really sit down and ask ourselves and each other questions about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And the COVID is sort of a good jumping off point, but it can't be the end of it.
Okay, Mr. Attorney, Altweiss, would you like to take that question too?
Sure. I actually completely agree with what Ben said. The pandemic actually hit when I was still campaigning for the position. And so I definitely had some progressive ideas for change in our system anyway. But I knew that it could be sort of a hard slog, you know, convincing different justice partners that we need to do things differently. And then the pandemic sort of forced all of our hands into going in that direction, whether that we wanted to or not. And I think it's shown us that there are some alternatives, and that particularly with what happened last summer and, you know, all the protest movements, I think it brought a whole lot of new questions and potential new solutions that we might not have had the room to think about, to deal with, if we didn't have the pandemic, because it really brought everything to a stop in our system. And so I'm hopeful that as we start back up, we can start back up in a smarter way, and also remain partners and agencies that work together, like, for example, with the public defender, in ways that we worked during the pandemic that we wouldn't have worked prior to this.
Yeah, is the you mentioned the thing about looking at the jail population and assessing people. Is that a practice that's continuing between your offices?
It hasn't needed to continue because we kind of got the people out of jail that were eligible to get out. And then we've adopted sort of an ad hoc policy in my office that we really try all available alternatives before we go for jailing someone. And so we haven't had to partner to come up with lists of people that perhaps we could get out, because that we just sort of adopted that policy moving forward. If we thought they were eligible to get out, then let's let them out. There's no reason to be holding them, and it's just exposing them, you know, to more illness potentially. And so certainly in the future, if it becomes a thing, we will work with the public defenders and the courts and probation and parole again. But it hasn't been as necessary for us since the initial.
Okay. Yeah, and finally, our representatives from probation, Ms. Martinez and Ms. Goggin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or
Well, you know, with probation parole, I will just add that we were starting this process prior to COVID. And I think, yes, COVID did amp it up a little, but we were already working to, you know, use jail diversion programs, you know, alternatives to detention sanctions, exhausting all resources available prior to incarceration. So it did continue through the pandemic, but it, you know, again, it had started pre-COVID.
Yeah, okay. So one other question I have actually for the people from probation, have there been any problems with backups at all with COVID, or increased demand on, you know, external outside of incarceration measures?
And I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you're referencing as far as backups.
Oh, I like increased demand causing, like, you know, difficult, like overworking or something like that, or is the workload pretty good at probation right now?
So right now our caseloads are manageable throughout the state. You know, our intake slowed down a bit. They didn't completely stop, but our caseloads are manageable. We have a great, you know, we have a low vacancy rate as far as probation parole officer positions. So that's helped. I think it caused, you know, probation officers to stay a little longer with us as far as employment goes, just because the state was, you know, was shut down and unemployment was on the rise. I think we held on to officers a little longer than what we usually do.
Okay. Let's see. All right, so I guess, I don't know, do we have any questions in the Q&A? Not yet. Okay. Yeah, so I was wondering, actually, going back to Ben and the district attorney, I don't know, are there any other, in the future, collaborations between your two offices to, you know, look into alternatives to incarceration, or things you'd like to try in the future? I know that seemed like I've never heard like anything about that, the jail collaboration before. I thought that was pretty interesting. So I was wondering if there's anything on your end that you'd be interested in looking into. That's
Sure. Well, for me, I'll say that, and the district attorney Carmack Allweiss and I have already talked about working on alternatives kind of sentencing ideas and structures in restorative justice. And I know she's using that on at least one group of cases right now. And I hope that that's something, you know, this short pause in kind of the volume of cases can help us restructure to look at that.
Okay, cool. Let's see. So I thought it was interesting that both the district attorney Allweiss and the public defender both mentioned that they had observed a significant decrease in criminal activity during the pandemic, especially towards the beginning. I mean, just as someone who, both of you are on the front lines of this, I was kind of wondering if I could hear a little bit more obviously knowing that this is just a little bit speculative, but what you think is kind of driving those changes.
You know, I have absolutely no idea what's driving the changes. It was pretty surprising at the beginning. It really slowed to a true trickle, and my only explanation, and it's based on no data whatsoever, but it was just that everyone sort of went home and actually just kind of maybe chilled out for a while, and because there wasn't as much face-to-face interaction, people weren't able or to get as many drugs or to get as much alcohol, or maybe they were getting it, but they weren't partying around other people. And I mean, it just seemed like it absolutely cratered. And then as time went on, people stopped wanting to abide by the shutdown quite as much. And so then we started seeing it slowly start ticking back up. I don't know, maybe Ben has another idea.
Well, I think that's right. And I will tell you that statewide, the increase, and Mary mentioned this before, the increase in violent crimes, the increase in murders, and this is not just an Albuquerque or New Mexico thing. This is a nationwide phenomenon, which a lot of people are struggling to understand. And my concern is that we talk about this trend, I think it will recede. And I am concerned as the public defender that an overreaction in terms of increasing policing or penalties or something we think that will be useful, but doesn't address what is some underlying social trend, which neither Mary nor I nor probably anybody else here quite understands at this point. I don't want to take the wrong lesson and do the wrong things rather than address the underlying root causes, which I think are the availability of guns, poverty, drugs, and some of the other things which unfortunately have been around for a long time.
Okay, thank you. So I'm looking at the Q&A. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions. I don't know if Angelica or Sherry would like to say anything more.
Hi, I just typed into the chat that the recording of this webinar and the slides will be available within a day or so on our website. And in closing, the New Mexico Sentencing Commission would like to thank all panelists and participants for participating in today's webinar, even though we know you're busy with yet another COVID transition period and fiscal year end. But thanks everyone for your time.